Rebekah, thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited to have you. So I wonder if you could start by giving us some context for you.
Okay, so as far as my faith background goes, I was brought up in sort of an interfaith families,
Okay.
Judeo-Christian or Jewish Christian, literally. Um, and until maybe high school or college around then, it was sort of a bridge of both faiths. When I went to college, I decided to join a Christian community. Later on, I found out that it's what we now call like evangelical Christian community. Um,
Mhm.
at the time, it was sort of segregated. So you'd have like Black Christians, Asian Christians, Latinx Christians, white Christians, sort of. But later on, there was more of an integration, I think, between my sophomore and junior years. So, but it was that context I've basically been in until seminary.
Mm.
And then I guess simultaneously, there's the issue of like figuring out like what is my sexuality, like what is going on over there. And definitely there was a conflict. I never like spoke about anything out loud until seminary. So like family didn't know, friends didn't know, but there was definitely that little conflict. Right now,
Mhm.
I work in a Baptist context, though that's not fully how I identify, but it's been a very wonderful community for me.
Mhm. Awesome. So that's a pretty interesting like start to your journey. So you said you grew up with Jewish and Christian family. And so I wonder, how did that inform your own views about sexuality and gender?
I think it was definitely what you would think of as like biblical, as like whatever how it's interpreted as like a male and a female person marries and has children, and that's the purpose of marriage.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. So you said that you joined a more evangelical community in college,
Yeah.
right? So what kind of community was your Christian community before that?
Um, Probably the same. I mean, I just know it as Pentecostal. So
Okay. I come from a Pentecostal background too, so I would definitely classify Pentecostals and evangelicals as separate. I
yeah.
think of it as a Venn diagram, right? There's overlaps, but there's definitely some differences in there. Yeah. Um, okay. So that's very interesting. So, and you said now you're in a Baptist community. Is
Yeah.
it American Baptist?
Yes. So we are in an urban area, so we combine multiple Baptist conventions
Okay.
or denominations, but mainly American Baptist. At least I recognize American Baptist because they're the one that signed my license. So
Uh-huh. Right. Yeah. So what made you go that route?
this was part of my field education, actually. My
Mm,
summer position was as an intern at this church. And it was through that position that I was able to see like what the leadership was like, what the commitments of our senior pastor and leadership were. And I felt like it was very much a good place for me to contribute to serving the community and serving the congregation. And because I knew that like our pastor is affirming that if any time anything were to happen, I would still be safe, at least like under him.
mhm. Yeah. So that really makes a difference, right? Finding a pastor that's affirming. What was that like for you when you learned that the pastor was affirming?
It was actually interesting at the time. So around that time, I wasn't like fully out and I wasn't sure that I wanted to be. So I was very
Mm,
much expressing sort of like concern, like I know this is something you're committed to. I don't know if I fully agree. I don't know how comfortable I feel. And it's just like trying so hard to um not to let anything on.
mhm.
Yeah. But now obviously it's there, like my coworkers know. Um
Yeah. And what is your role there now?
So right now I am an associate minister, which basically means
Okay.
I preach occasionally, but my full-time role is as the director of media and communications. So I'm pretty much
Okay.
working in like social media, web updating their websites, um, yeah, pretty much like anything tech wise, whatever you see affiliated with us is probably something that I've done.
Okay. That's pretty awesome. So you're in a similar role as Emmy for us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wonder, what was that process like of sort of realizing your sexuality? What kind of, was there something that prompted it? Or did the environment around you change? What happened?
So this actually, I remember this might have been either seventh or eighth grade.
Mm,
So I had like and I'm still not sure exactly how to describe it, but I had a moment where I was definitely attracted to like this older student. I don't know if she's like a junior or a senior. I don't remember. But I had that moment and I was like, oh, okay. And it has not gone away. So I consider myself like attracted to, well, people of multiple gender identities. Yeah.
okay. Yeah. Yeah. And so you knew pretty young then, but you were still in a more conservative context in terms of religion. And
Yeah.
then you went to seminary. And is that when you started exploring affirming theology?
It was the first time that I had heard of affirming theology. When I was in college, I was at the very beginning, I was connecting with like the LGBT people of color, but it
Okay.
wasn't in like a
Uh-huh.
Christian context. That didn't happen until seminary.
Yeah. So what was that like connecting with LGBT people of color who were not in a Christian context?
I mean, at the time, I didn't really feel like any religious connection or anything like that
Okay.
mattered. I just remember feeling comfortable around them and accepted, even though like they might not have known like the entirety of who I was. I was still like working through, should I have a label? Should I not? What's going on? But that,
Mhm.
and ironically, the Christian community that I was in later on were the two places where I felt equally comfortable. Though, of course, like if I were to have come out, it would have had terrible consequences.
Yeah. What would those consequences have been? Do you know?
Honestly, in that tradition, probably like removal from not entire, maybe not removal from the community. At least I hope it wouldn't have been that drastic. But any leadership role I would have been in would have been like cut immediately, probably on
Mhm.
some sort of like probation or something. I'm not sure how it works, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, something I experienced when I came out was people, they sort of responded with pity, right? Like I had been a leader in the community, and then all of a sudden it was like, oh, poor Lance, like it was sort of like, I don't know. Like they just assumed that I had lost my way, right? There was no seeking to understand where I was at or how I came to my conclusion. It was just like, no, this is the conclusion we've already decided, and that's it. Like I could no longer be in leadership positions in that context. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty similar. I don't, I think, mm, I don't, I wouldn't say that I had like a similar response from other people. Whereas I think the most recent time that I would say like I came out, um, like publicly, was really the first time that I had a large audience for it was when I posted on Facebook about a month ago that I was president of the LGBT organization at Truth Seminary, and
Mhm.
so that had a larger audience and people who I know would not have agreed. I don't remember if they interacted with it or not. I remember mostly receiving support.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a huge thing, right? Like you go from being in a Christian community where you can't even identify in that way. And if you do, there are real ramifications, right? You no longer have a voice in the same way. You're sort of you're allowed to be welcomed, right? But you don't get to
Mm,
really belong in the same
yeah.
way. And now you're at Drew Seminary leading their LGBTQ ministry. So, can you say a little bit more about what that's been like for you?
Yeah, it's definitely an adjustment. Because I've been in part of organizations like this before. So like ABS, Association of Black Seminarians in
Mhm.
Princeton. I was on board there. Just I other ministry roles, other leadership roles, but I think it was a huge step to be sort of the face, sort of forefront of an organization that supports queer people and queer identities, especially
Mhm.
considering the background that I came out of. But
Mhm.
it's something that I really hope to do well at, really hope to be like a voice of support for our community.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean that's pretty incredible that you have made that journey, right? Yeah, and it's exciting when you're able to then be in the role of providing support, right? Where people recognize your leadership in that capacity and you get to pour into others in that way. Could you say anything about what your time at Princeton Seminary was like? What was that
Yes.
like for you in terms of navigating your sexuality and the community?
When I started at Princeton Seminary, I felt like I wanted to kind of like completely start over. I was in a place where no one knew me. I even changed my name. Like I used to go by my first name. And I was like, no, I'm going to go by my middle name. Everyone's going to call me Rebekah. I'm going to be
I
like this
love it.
completely different person. Um,
Mhm.
and out of college, I was like, let me see, do they have like what's the equivalent of like a college Republicans? Do they have that? Is there like an evangelical student organization? It sounds completely ridiculous right now. But I was like, yes, let's start over. And of course, the evangelical organization did not exist. So it was just me on my own for the first year or so. Um, and then later on, my first internship. So my first internship during my middle year was with Princeton Presbyterians, was Lana and Andrew Scales. And that was where I was able to get
Mm.
really better knowledge and education about like queer theologies, about how what we consider like evangelical theology or traditional Christian orthodoxy, how that was has been constructed and how harmful it is. And I'm just like, oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So that they definitely played a big role in me being comfortable to share that I at the time I would have used the word queer. Yeah, share my identity with other people. It was very slow at first, like a few people that I knew I could trust, a few close friends, and then later on more.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, again, I think this highlights the importance of having leaders in the Christian community who can help us with navigating these things, right? Even if they themselves are not part of the LGBTQ community, but they can be people who make us feel safe and make us know that it's okay to bring our full selves into that space or bring that part of ourselves. It makes such a difference. Yeah. So, what did you find? I mean, you and I went to the same seminary. I think we overlapped 1 year. I remember meeting you, I think it was in Brown Hall. But what did you find in terms of like I mean, it's very interesting being at a place where everybody's trying to be a pastor, right? You
Definitely.
know, how did you experience other students in terms of like, the how they thought about sexuality and Christianity or gender identity and Christianity? I mean, I felt from my experience was it was a pretty mixed bag. But I wonder, I mean, you were there a little later, I wonder what it was like for you.
Yeah, so I agree. It's very different opinions and stuff. I what I mainly remember is just being sort of like in awe at how like confident everyone was. I remember the year that Tim Keller was supposed to speak, we
Mhm.
had like the preach in, and I remember just the confidence, like people who were so assured of their security in God and their call, their love for God, God's love for them. And I was like, wow, okay. And there's so many things I was thinking through and questioning at that time. It's like, oh, okay. Um, and definitely didn't like, I don't mean that in like a bad way or anything. It's just there is a lot that I am being challenged by right now. And the outcome was definitely good.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah. Um, and I also remember the ministry that I led senior year. It had, I think, I think you would say it had an evangelical leaning in the more traditional sense of the word. If you think about like how their services are structured, like prayer and worship, things like that. But at the same
Mhm.
time, it had never been, to my knowledge, anything that was like sectarian or exclusive or anything. So it was cool being able to stay, especially during that year, come into more of myself while also being part of a tradition that I still felt comfortable in.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the big things that I think about a lot is, I mean, and I talked about this with Emmy when in the episode that will be coming out soon. But it does often feel like people who are part of the LGBTQ plus community are asked, specifically in Christian circles, they're asked either to like sacrifice some part of
Yeah.
themselves, right? So it's like you can sacrifice your queerness, or you can sort of sacrifice your tradition and you have to like move to a whole new tradition, right? And it can feel like, I mean, I know people who are still in non-affirming churches, because um, they've gone to they've gone to these churches that are affirming, and when they get there it's like, this doesn't feel familiar to me at all, this doesn't feel like home. So I wonder, I mean, you talk about being able to be in a space where you're able to bring both parts of yourself, but how have you found that in your current work context?
I think it's actually been much easier in this context because when I was in seminary, I was still trying to hold myself to a standard of like what I should be or what I thought I should be. But here, it's really, I don't have any of that pressure, at least not from the people. mm, I guess not from the people who are closest to me. I, I mean, with the congregation, we have lots of very diverse, well, on as far as like age, culture, things like that. So definitely lots of different opinions, but I'm thinking more in context of like my pastor and people whom I
Mhm.
immediately work under. I don't feel like I have to like shrink or hide or do anything like that. It's just I'm able to be more of myself.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes such a difference. What would you say were the like indicators at this church that let you know that it was safe? Like, did the pastor talk openly about their position, or how
It's
did you know?
definitely the preaching is what got me. Um, it's just not a. I appreciate someone who's not afraid to speak out, not afraid to speak truth, and just stand out in support of people. Um, I was, yeah, because I also saw that during my internship before I had even decided to become a member of the church. And that was one of the reasons why I had joined.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's amazing when people do sort of use sermons as a way to really open space, right? To say, this is
Yes.
where I am, and this is where I want to show you you can be, right? It's an invitation to change. So, in your journey, what do you feel like has been, one of the most significant shifts for you? Like, what would you feel like if you could give it to someone else who was in your shoes before, what would you want to offer them as far as what helped you make those shifts?
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not entirely sure. I'm looking back on like where I used to be, especially like in college. Like, you know how Facebook memories come up, and I'm looking at some
Mm-hmm.
I made. I'm like, Jesus, who is she? What was she on?
uh-huh.
But,
Right.
mm, I think if I were to give any sort of like advice, it would be to not to worry too much about like other people's opinions and beliefs or anything. And I know it definitely is challenging when up until, well, basically your entire life up until you were an adult, you heard like one specific narrative of what love looks like, what sexuality looks like, what relationships look like, and you don't really have like a community or anyone to show you that there is another way that is true and good and beautiful. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think it's so true, right? That we need communities to help us see other ways of existing, right? Like, I mean, I think about my own childhood, and there's so many things that's like, oh, I don't, it's like I just didn't know or see that there was another way to be. And now, I have seen that there's other ways to be, and it has helped me to come into that way of being. Yeah. Is there anything else that you feel like has been really transformational on your journey? Like, for instance, I know a lot of people, one of the places that they do really struggle is with the scriptures and how they read the scriptures and think about the scriptures. Like, what was that transition like for you?
I think there was a combination. So I think because of my background, I have not the combination, the opportunity to sort of look at the Bible and analyze it, yes, from the lens of sexuality, but also like race and just justice and everything in general. And learning about just how it was compiled, how the canon was created, how you select books, who wrote it, that helps when you realize that it's not, well, I would not have been able to say this years ago, but it's not like 100% like God ordained, God written book. Like it's something
Right.
that people created and people have biases and agendas. So what's important to me is looking at the gospels and what Jesus did and how it sort of connects to the whole story. And that's what I look to. I'm not as concerned. So once I was able to understand all of that, I was just, what matters to me is whether I reflect Jesus's character and if I'm in a place where people love like he did. And that's the most basic way I can explain this. And
Yeah.
whatever identity I may have, whatever I may be working through, it's not what everyone has really made it out to be at all.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, there's like so much demonization, but I think, like you said, being able to be exposed to other people and to see their lives up close, to see their lives in community, it can be so empowering and help us see that, right, we all have biases, right? And it can help us adjust. And these biases become internalized even when it's about ourselves, right? So I think one last question that I would love to explore with you is thinking specifically about race and culture in terms of how that impacts the LGBTQ community. And I think the reality is that, you know, we can often think of the LGBTQ community as like this great rainbow, but racism exists there too, right? And so I wonder, do you have any thoughts about that?
I don't really have much experience in that, at least not personally. Like I know of it, but fortunately I haven't really experienced that. Most concerns I had that were similar to that were in like religious spaces, not
Mm,
necessarily in queer spaces. I know about like I don't know if it's a stereotype or just a general thought about sort of like homophobia that exists in like Black spaces, especially like Black Christian spaces. But really also it depends. It's just as like opinions, views are just as diverse as in other communities. I wouldn't say there's anything that makes these communities like more homophobic or worse than others.
mm,
Definitely not. Um,
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it is just so interesting to look at like all the intersections of these identities, right? And it is complex, like you're saying, right? And it's not like there's monoliths, right? People within these communities think differently and have different experiences that they're bringing to the table. And so, but I think, like you said, right, having that sort of principle at the end of the day to say, like, am I experiencing the love here? Am I finding like people loving like Jesus loved here? And if so, right, we can let our guard down. It allows us to come into the space. And if not, right, that gives us some pause, something to say, I'm not sure if this is the space for me. Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this, Rebekah. I wonder, are there any other thoughts that you want to share?
I think that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for being willing to come on here and, take time out of your day to talk to us and share your experience. So thank you.